The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. Caught between a declining world order and a future of infinite possibilities, Friedrich Nietzsche was a philosopher who sought to construct an entirely new outlook on life. His philosophy is bold, provocative, beautiful, and at times, its harsh truths can even be painful. But they are, according to him, necessary for us to become strong and free. After all, it was he who coined the phrase, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." I have to be honest with you all. This man, Friedrich Nietzsche, is so important, so influential to me that it was hard to decide how to do this video. I was afraid I would fail to deliver, that I might screw up in a way that would potentially betray his concepts. Probably more than that, though, I couldn't decide how I would try to tell you this story. To me, this isn't just a philosopher. He isn't simply someone who has made some good distinctions and maybe has some insight. This is a man who has directly, and I mean as direct as possible for someone who's, well, dead, helped me overcome some of the deepest and most elusive problems in my life. From unaddressed childhood issues and psychological trauma to personal relationships and self-growth, Nietzsche has helped me tackle and overcome things I couldn't even directly acknowledge before. He showed me that there are no beautiful surfaces without a terrible depth. Because of this deep personal connection, I decided the best way to communicate his ideas in a way that might actually help someone watching this was to tell some of his life story alongside them. For Nietzsche, perhaps more than any other thinker, philosophy was about dealing directly with aspects of actual life and experience in a way that actually worked. Not just the perfect idea of life that's hardly achievable or some kind of sugarcoating tactic to dress it up. An actual attempt to turn the bitterness of pain into sweet gold. And so, in this video, I will do my best to tell some of that story, to actually get into the head of one of the most complex minds that has ever walked the earth. In this story, you will find more than a bunch of abstract concepts. You will be shown a man trying to deal with sickness, heartbreak, loss of friendships, a difficult family, and so much more. You will see a man who wants nothing more than to show everyone that even when it seems like you've lost everything, like the very framework of your life has collapsed in on you, there is a secret power within you so potent and universal that it's worth fighting for. Nietzsche's philosophy is not a collection of works. It's not an encyclopedia of facts and principles to memorize. It is a deeply human journey, and one that calls out to everyone. From the lowliest peasant to the richest king, everyone can and deserves to hear what Nietzsche has to say. And so, I present to you the life, mind, and philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche. But before we get into it, we have a small announcement. We have officially qualified and become partnered on YouTube. This is great news, but we are still a very small channel, and we have a lot of work to do when it comes to making the best possible content for you guys. Videos take a ton of time to research, write, and edit, and we are trying to get better with every single one, and it isn't easy to get going on this platform. So any support from you guys really would mean anything. Consider becoming a member and you will get access to exclusive content. Otherwise, consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment if you enjoy this video. While he would later become infamous for controversial proclamations like "God is dead," his early life was marked by a conservative Lutheran influence. This is because his father was a minister, and the very young Nietzsche adored his father. He was always by his side, always wanting to emulate and be like him, but tragedy struck when Nietzsche was still just a little kid, with his father dying of a degenerative brain disease. This occurred slowly and painfully over the course of a year. This had a deep impact on him, and he was often buried in the pages of the Bible, trying to honor him and understand him in any way, and probably mostly because he simply missed him. The other boys even referred to him as the little minister, because of how inseparable he was from that Bible. On top of this, Nietzsche's brother also died shortly after. This left him with no major male mentors or father figures in his life, and this would be something that will show up later, in possibly the most important relationship of his life, one that would sting him even deeper than the death of his father, but we will get there in a moment. He also suffered from a range of physical illnesses. including severe digestion problems, debilitating migraines that resulted in temporary blindness, and many more. The death of family members and the lack of control over his health would form the early soil of one of his most important concepts: suffering. The constant struggle with poor health and these early events ingrained in Nietzsche an idea that was rare for his time, that suffering was an important, even good, part of life that we should be thankful for. After all, after each blinding migraine or family member lost, a new day did come. There was, just like before, smiles, laughs, and all the joys of life. This idea of finding love in the world right from a site of deep pain will be very important later on. His desire to understand and do right by his father would take a very different form as he moved into adulthood. Nietzsche was an incredibly bright and gifted young scholar, and very quickly became disillusioned with his Christian upbringing once he entered university. But he didn't see this as a betrayal. And this part is simply my own intuition, but I think he actually felt he was tapping into something about his father that is deeper than any of us can understand. And this is partially because he once noted, "What was silent in the father speaks in the son, and often I found in the son the unveiled secret of the father." What he might have found admirable and memorable in his father, he finally realized, wasn't simply his job as a minister or his pious behavior. It could be separated from something cultural or religious. That said, Nietzsche had surely been exposed to some new literature at university, works that were already turning away from a deeply religious way of thinking. But the element that pushed him over the edge was his encounter with the work of Arthur Schopenhauer. You see, Nietzsche didn't get his start in philosophy. He was actually a philologist by training. A philologist is someone who studies and interprets the culture and literature of classical civilizations, and this was probably the most popular intellectual field of the time. But in Schopenhauer, Nietzsche found, as he noted, something that seemed to be addressing him directly. Schopenhauer's conception of the will, an amoral force devoid of any objective meaning that underpins all of existence and ultimately renders all attempts to control life completely useless, was a breath of fresh air and a huge inspiration. It is likely here that Nietzsche began to understand his true calling. That said, he did incredibly well in philology, being published as a student and allowed to skip most of graduate school and go straight to being a professor. This is the beginning of what is likely the happiest time of his life, short as it will be. And it is here that we will learn a big life lesson for ourselves, that we can't control who we are, what we want, and most importantly, cannot control who we love. It is around the time he began as a professor at the University of Basel that he met famous German composer Richard Wagner. Nietzsche would form a deep relationship with Wagner and his wife, Cosimo. But this new phase would also begin to form the cracks that would pull his life apart. You see, despite having everything he ever wanted, all the respect and accolades a young intellectual could ever hope to have, he just couldn't bury what his heart truly desired. His passion for philosophy was awakened, and it was only a matter of time before it would take over his life. While still in his 20s, he finished his first major work, The Birth of Tragedy, out of the spirit of music. Most people only ever publish the first part of that title, but the music is a central part of the work. Nietzsche was so enamored by Wagner that he actually believed that his music was awakening something in Europe that hadn't been seen since the days of ancient Greece. In this book, Nietzsche criticized Victorian-era Europe for its overly moralistic society, a society that promoted sedentary living, a docile demeanor, and a suppression of all animalistic passions that exist within us all. Nietzsche looked back and, with his great knowledge of classical Greece, recognized that the festivals and tragic plays of the time did something Europe was entirely incapable of doing: affirming one's life. Because they ignored their darker half, European Christians missed some of the most beautiful things in life. And in this, he thought it was obvious that people would turn to an afterlife for some comfort, because what else is left if the passions are all eliminated? But, long story short, everybody hated it. Most people couldn't even understand what he was saying, and many criticized him for things he never said or meant. He went from having respect and admiration to being ostracized and rejected by fellow intellectuals. This absolutely devastated him. On top of this, he soon found that Wagner was not what he thought he was, beginning to write music that was too nationalistic. Nietzsche found himself in a difficult spot. His colleagues didn't like him because he followed his gut, and the father figure he thought he saw in Wagner was a disappointment. Where was he to take his life now? Nietzsche expressed feeling overwhelmed with sickness during this period, with his constant ailments severely flared up with all the psychological stress. It is in moments like this that are most important in understanding who Nietzsche is. The power of perspective, the power of understanding the value of pain, and something that he now starts to understand, that the world is forever and always in a state of change. As one of his favorite ancient philosophers, Heraclitus, once said, "We never step in the same river twice." Nietzsche came to see that death, loss, change in circumstances, and changes in one's own heart are inevitable. The trick to a good life, then, is not to pursue one final goal or build a perfect life that will never change, because the second you get the goal, you will be unsatisfied and need a new one, and the perfect life you imagine in your head will never be as you pictured it. Not only will you change on your way to it, but the life itself will eventually end too. But we aren't supposed to just think this is okay and learn to deal with it. We're actually supposed to learn to love it, to love things for what they are and let them go when their time comes. Because it is literally in that process that the world lives. Plants grow from decomposed ones, babies are grown from dead plants and animals, and worlds are created from dead stars. It is only because things die that you are alive. And more importantly, it is because things die that any of the people you have ever loved existed at all. Life and death, light and dark, perhaps even good and evil, are part of one unified process. This revelation about the creative power that bursts out from the painful ashes of loss is the foundation of his entire philosophy. Nietzsche left his post at Basel and began the most important but lonely period of his life, the period where he would write his great works. While often associated with the idea of reveling in one's own company and being the master of one's own destiny, it is important to remember that this lonely work was not something he actually wanted, but something he felt was inevitable to do great things. He felt he needed to do. He knew that in the mix of the masses, he wouldn't have the strength to go through with the project of the transvaluation of all values. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often, and sometimes frightened, but no price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself. The early part of this period is marked by what Nietzsche would call philosophizing with a hammer. He began the process of deconstructing the values, ideals, and beliefs of mankind. In works like Human All Too Human, he criticizes the very fabric of Western thought, upending the focus on human perfection and the search for absolute meaning with an aggressive attack. The big danger approaching Europe, and perhaps the whole world, in his eyes, is nihilism. What is nihilism? In its most serious and lasting sense, nihilism is when the thought of nothingness, when the feeling of meaningless existence goes from merely a temporary state of despair to a lasting life outlook. As a collective culture, Europe had been held together by a single narrative through the institution of Christianity. And with the decline of God, it was only a matter of time before the shock of this loss would lead to incredible dangers. In fact, Nietzsche predicted many of the horrors of the 20th century, often warning of the dangers of German nationalism and even claiming that there would be a great burning of books and an effort to destroy intellectual history in an attempt to construct a new, singular, unified meaning. This is exactly what the Nazis tried to do. While some looked to cling to traditional values as a way of preventing collapse, Nietzsche sought to forge a third way, a path to a new history and a new type of human that could be free not just from the values of the past, but perhaps even from the constant need to have beliefs and values to tell them what to do and how to live. What he was searching for was a means of reinvention, a way for us to evolve as life and the cosmos demands it instead of desperately clinging to that which has passed. The snake which cannot cast its skin has to die. As well, the minds which are prevented from changing their opinions, they cease to be mind. Nietzsche continues this deconstruction in one of his most important works, The Gay Science. But there is a shift in his thinking during this period. While he felt he needed to dismantle the hypocrisies of Western religion and dogma, he was at heart trying to save much of it. This shift is shown in the opening of Book 4. Perhaps from the window of his quaint Genoan room or the harbor that so captivated him, Nietzsche sensed the changing spirit of the new year and decided that it was time to hang up the hammer. He wishes for an end to the laborious work of accusing, defying, and shattering of ideas. He writes, "I shall thus be one of those who beautify things. Amor fati, let that henceforth be my love. I do not want to wage war with the ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not want even to accuse the accusers. Looking aside, let that be my sole negation. And all in all, to sum up, I wish to be at any time hereafter only a yes-sayer." Nietzsche often expressed how painful and lonely it was to undertake the project he did, even remarking that his books seemed to jump off the shelf and beg him to move on, pestering him to stop being so negative. He also discussed the overwhelming fear of being completely wrong or having one's work never be truly read or discovered. But somehow he managed to keep the strength to stay the course. Even with all the talk of overcoming traditional values and morality to forge one's own path, it must have still been incredibly difficult to continue, especially because his books were seeing essentially zero success or recognition. So how did he do it? This brings us to the moment that changed everything. In the summer of 1881, Nietzsche made his way to the Swiss Alps. As he took a long walk through the woods, which he did frequently, he came across something strange, a pyramid-shaped rock he had never seen before. It was a towering, almost monolithic structure with an otherworldly presence to it. It was here in this very spot that an idea so potent and life-changing invaded his body. This was the thought of eternal recurrence and the character of Zarathustra. If you want to learn more about this event, we actually have a video that covers it more specifically. He jotted the note down and ran back to his room to begin working. In just 10 days, he wrote the first installment of one of the greatest books in the last 200 years, Thus Spake Zarathustra. While most people focus on the Übermensch, putting it forward as an archetype of a person who overcomes given values to create their own and live freely, I think it is far more important that we cover the eternal recurrence and amor fati first, so we can understand the Übermensch in a more complex way, the way Nietzsche really meant it. Nietzsche initially lays out eternal recurrence in the gay science as a form of thought experiment, one where you are told you would have to relive your life over and over, prompting you to look at each decision in life through that lens. But what we get in Thus Spake Zarathustra is far more complex, beautiful, and liberating. Taking seriously the idea of eternal recurrence, the idea that energy and matter are in a perpetual state of creation and destruction, that all things are destined to stretch outward but ultimately return to themselves, is a means of liberating us from the shackles of our historical and social roles in society and elsewhere. Just think about it. When we make a decision, pick a path, hobbies, affiliations, post on social media, tell people what to do, vote, quite literally anything, we look at it through the lens of our social identity and the story we think we're living. But when we realize we are in a state of constant change because of eternal recurrence, we at first are forced to think painfully and let things go. However, when we decide to affirm eternal recurrence through amor fati, the love of our fate to constantly change, we can transcend beyond this static life. This life lived in service of a role assigned to us by society or our past, to become, finally, who we really are. Time itself changes here. It changes from a life to be endured in service of a role, a sequence of events narrated by that role, to a constant return to opportunities for joy. Instead of a life of suffering, pain, and work, we learn love, true love. The concept of love, to him, is more than a simple romantic or lustful love. To Nietzsche, it is a pre-psychological, literally a structure of being itself concept. It's the creative force that permeates the entire cosmos, and this is how we can truly see it. He lays this out beautifully in a note from his Will to Power collection. He writes, "A full and powerful soul not only copes with painful, even terrible losses, deprivations, robberies, insults. It emerges from such hells with greater fullness and powerfulness, and, most essential of all, with a new increase in the blissfulness of love. I believe that he who has divined something of the most basic conditions for this growth in love will understand what Dante meant when he wrote over the gates of his Inferno, 'I, too, was created by eternal love.'" Do not mistake this man for a cold-hearted egoist seeking to be free from morality and God to build some world of the Übermensch to dominate it. Übermensch is an ideal, something for us all to strive towards. After all, Nietzsche said that until access to the truths laid out thus far by him are available to everyone and at all times, we will still live in the era of tragedy. What Nietzsche wants from you, from me, from us all, is to direct our creativity outward into the world. To have deep love for that which we cherish and dream of most. To move beyond the history of mankind dominated by ideologies and religions, beyond the kings, popes, and politicians we bow to a world of free spirits. A world that is finally, truly, a reflection of who we are. Sadly, Thus Spake Zarathustra saw no success at the time, even bankrupting his publisher. During the last few years of his sane life, his health began to decline rapidly, often going days without sleep due to extreme vomiting and continuous blinding migraines. He endured periods of intense loneliness, writing letters to friends that he hadn't felt so much as a hug from another person in several years. These fits of illness were made worse when he was prescribed an incorrect dose of medication to help with his digestion that actually ended up amplifying his symptoms dramatically. His migraine symptoms also became so bad that the noise of thunderstorms would leave him completely debilitated. He knew that his time was running out, and even though he had written his masterpiece, he felt there was so much more to say. In the last year of his life, he wrote 4 books, and he was compiling notes for a massive 10-volume work that would have been titled The Will to Power. But before he could complete this, he fell prey to a manic episode, collapsing in the street upon seeing a horse getting flogged and telling the horse he understood him. After sending nonsense letters to the few friends he had left, he was found in a state of mental collapse. Nietzsche's already tragic life would end even worse. His sister would turn his works into Nazi propaganda, altering them to fit nationalist ideals, and is even rumored to, at times, have kept him chained in the attic. Nietzsche died in 1899, alone, mad, and unrecognized for his genius. Or perhaps his life can be seen as the ultimate sacrifice. Nietzsche transformed himself so completely, he deviated from the beaten path so far that there was no world for him here. As he wrote in Zarathustra, "I walk among men as fragments of the future." He showed us that our world was broken. He showed us that our desperate search for meaning could turn violent. And he showed us that the only way to save ourselves was to look forward, not to the past. In this path, we must begin alone. We must stare into the abyss and be able to bear what it sends back our way. And it is love and love alone that may guide us to our own amor fati.